The sound of handcuffs clicking shut never sounded so sweet. I watched from my car across the street as federal agents led my former boss out of the Meridian Financial building in handcuffs, his expensive suit wrinkled and his face pale with shock. 3 days ago, I was supposedly just another mid-level accountant who had been reassigned to the basement for asking too many questions. Today, I was the whistleblower who brought down one of the most elaborate corporate fraud schemes in recent history. My name is Jessica Walsh, and this is the story of how I discovered a $15 million fraud, got demoted for it, and then watched the entire executive team get arrested by the FBI exactly 72 hours later. It all started on a Tuesday morning in March. I'd been working as a senior financial analyst at Meridian Financial Services for 3 years, and I prided myself on being thorough with the numbers, maybe too thorough, as it turned out. I was reviewing the quarterly reports when I noticed something that made my coffee go cold. The numbers didn't add up, not in a small, rounding error kind of way, but in a massive, $15 million discrepancy kind of way. I stared at my computer screen, running the calculations again and again. The company's reported earnings to shareholders showed a healthy profit, but when I cross-referenced the internal expense reports and revenue streams, there was a gaping hole that someone had apparently tried to cover up with creative accounting. My hands trembled slightly as I printed out the documents. This wasn't just a mistake. This was deliberate. Someone at the top of Meridian Financial was cooking the books. And they were doing it on a scale that would make Enron executives proud. I knew I had to report this, but I also knew I had to be smart about it. Corporate whistleblowing wasn't exactly a career advancement strategy, and I had student loans to pay and a mortgage to worry about. But I also couldn't sit on information about a fraud that was stealing from shareholders and potentially putting the entire company at risk. I decided to start with my immediate supervisor, David Brennan. David was a decent guy, someone I'd worked with for 2 years without any major issues. He was in his early 40s, married with 2 kids, and seemed like the kind of person who would take financial irregularities seriously. I knocked on his office door that afternoon, my manila folder full of evidence clutched tightly in my hands. "David, do you have a minute? I need to discuss something urgent about the quarterly reports." He looked up from his computer, his friendly face creased with concern. "Of course, Jessica. What's going on?" I sat down and spread the documents across his desk. "I've found some significant discrepancies in our financial reporting. The numbers we're showing to shareholders don't match our internal records, and we're talking about a $15 million difference." David's expression shifted from concern to alarm as he looked at the papers. He studied them for several minutes, his brow furrowed in concentration. This is serious, Jessica. Are you absolutely certain about these calculations?" "I've checked them multiple times. The money is being moved around in ways that don't make sense unless someone is deliberately trying to hide losses or inflate profits." David leaned back in his chair, looking genuinely troubled. "Okay, I need to take this upstairs. This is way above my pay grade. Can you put together a comprehensive report with all your findings?" I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. At least David was taking it seriously. "I'll need a day or 2 to compile everything properly. But yes, I can have a full report ready by Thursday." "Good. And Jessica, keep this between us for now. If there really is fraud happening here, we need to handle it through proper channels." I spent the next 2 days putting together the most thorough financial analysis of my career. I documented every discrepancy, traced every suspicious transaction, and built a case that would be impossible to ignore. The evidence was overwhelming. Someone at Meridian Financial was systematically stealing from shareholders and lying about the company's financial health. On Thursday morning, I handed David a 40-page report that laid out the entire fraud scheme. He promised to take it directly to our VP of Finance, Margaret Stevenson, and assured me that they would investigate immediately. That was the last normal conversation I had at Meridian Financial. By Friday afternoon, I still hadn't heard anything back from David. When I tried to approach him about it, he seemed nervous and avoided eye contact. "These things take time, Jessica. Margaret is reviewing everything carefully." Something in his tone made my stomach clench with worry, but I tried to stay optimistic. Maybe they were just being thorough. The following Monday, I was called into Margaret Stevenson's office. Margaret was a formidable woman in her 50s, with silver hair and the kind of sharp business attire that screamed executive authority. She had always been cordial to me, but distant in the way that VPs are with mid-level employees. "Jessica, please sit down. We need to discuss your recent concerns about our financial reporting." I sat across from her mahogany desk, noticing that my carefully prepared report was nowhere to be seen. "I've reviewed the materials you provided to David, and I have to say, I'm disappointed in the approach you've taken here." My heart sank. This was not the response I had been hoping for. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand. The evidence clearly shows—" Margaret held up a hand to stop me. "What the evidence shows is that you've made some significant errors in your analysis. You've misunderstood our accounting practices and jumped to conclusions that are not only wrong but potentially damaging to the company." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "I've triple-checked all the calculations. The discrepancies are real. Jessica, I appreciate your enthusiasm for your work, but this kind of reckless speculation is exactly why we have proper procedures and oversight. You've overstepped your bounds significantly." Margaret's tone was becoming increasingly stern, and I realized with growing horror that this conversation was not going the way I had expected. "Your performance review is coming up, and frankly, this incident raises serious questions about your judgment and your ability to work effectively within our organizational structure." I felt my face burning with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Are you seriously suggesting that I should ignore evidence of fraud?" "I'm suggesting that you focus on your actual job responsibilities and leave complex financial analysis to those who are qualified to handle it." That stung. I had a master's degree in accounting and 3 years of solid performance reviews. I was qualified, and we both knew it. "Ma'am, with all due respect, these aren't minor errors. We're talking about $15 million in discrepancies. Even if I made some mistakes in my analysis, surely that warrants further investigation?" Margaret's expression hardened. "Jessica, I'm going to be very clear with you. This conversation is over. You will not pursue this matter further, and you will not discuss these allegations with anyone else in the company. Is that understood?" I stared at her, realizing that I was witnessing something much worse than corporate fraud. I was witnessing a cover-up. "And if I refuse?" Margaret's smile was ice cold. "Then you'll find that your career at Meridian Financial will be very short-lived." I left her office feeling like I was walking through quicksand. Everything I thought I knew about my company, my colleagues, and my own professional judgment was being called into question. But I knew what I had seen in those financial records, and I knew I was right. The next morning, I arrived at work to find an email waiting for me from Human Resources. I had been reassigned to a new position effective immediately. Instead of my comfortable office on the 8th floor, I was now reporting to the basement archives, where I would be responsible for organizing and digitizing historical financial records. It was a demotion disguised as a lateral move, and everyone knew it. My new office was a converted storage closet in the basement, with no windows, flickering fluorescent lights, and the constant hum of the building's HVAC system. Instead of analyzing current financial data, I was now spending my days scanning decades-old invoices and filing them in digital folders. The message was clear: shut up, or your career is over. But if Margaret Stevenson thought she could intimidate me into silence, she had seriously underestimated who she was dealing with. I spent my first week in the basement doing exactly what I was supposed to do, scanning old documents and trying to look defeated. But I was also doing something else. I was making copies of everything I had found, organizing my evidence, and researching my options. I had stumbled onto something big, and the fact that the company was trying so hard to bury it only confirmed that I was right. The question was, what was I going to do about it? I started by researching whistleblower protections and corporate fraud reporting procedures. I learned about the SEC's Office of the Whistleblower, which offered both legal protection and financial incentives for people who reported securities fraud. I also learned about the False Claims Act and other federal statutes that protected employees who reported corporate wrongdoing. Most importantly, I learned that I wasn't alone. There were resources available to help people in my situation, and there were federal agencies whose job it was to investigate exactly the kind of fraud I had uncovered. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that I had a moral and legal obligation to report what I had found. The shareholders of Meridian Financial were being defrauded, and potentially hundreds of employees could lose their jobs if the company collapsed due to financial irregularities. I also started paying closer attention to the office dynamics around me. Even though I was stuck in the basement, I still had access to the company's internal email system and shared drives. I began to notice patterns in the communications between senior executives that suggested my discovery had caused quite a stir in the C-suite. There were hushed conversations that stopped when I walked by, closed-door meetings that included people who didn't normally work together, and a general sense of tension that seemed to permeate the entire building. I also noticed that David Brennan, my former supervisor, was avoiding me entirely. When I passed him in the hallway, he would look the other way or suddenly become very interested in his phone. It was clear that he had been told to distance himself from me, probably to avoid any appearance of supporting my reckless allegations. But the most telling sign was Margaret Stevenson's behavior. She had always been a confident, authoritative presence in the office, but now she seemed nervous and distracted. I caught her staring at me during the one company meeting I attended, and her expression was not friendly. After 2 weeks in the basement, I made my decision. I was going to report the fraud to the SEC. I spent a weekend preparing my whistleblower complaint, carefully documenting every piece of evidence I had uncovered. I included copies of the financial records, my analysis of the discrepancies, and a detailed timeline of how the company had responded to my internal report. The SEC's whistleblower portal was surprisingly straightforward. I uploaded my documents, filled out the required forms, and provided my contact information. Within hours, I received an automated confirmation that my complaint had been received and assigned a case number. I also decided to make copies of all my evidence and store them in multiple locations. If Meridian Financial was willing to demote me for asking questions, there was no telling what they might do if they discovered I had gone to federal regulators. On Monday morning, I went to work as usual, scanning old invoices and pretending to be defeated. But inside, I was buzzing with anticipation. I had taken the first step toward exposing the fraud, and now I just had to wait for the SEC to investigate. I didn't have to wait long. On Tuesday afternoon, I received a call from an SEC investigator named Agent Patricia Reynolds. She had reviewed my complaint and wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss my findings in detail. Ms. Walsh, I want to be clear that we take these allegations very seriously. The evidence you've provided appears to be substantial, and we'd like to move forward with a formal investigation. My heart was racing. This was really happening. What do you need from me? We'd like to meet with you tomorrow morning to go over your evidence in detail. We may also need you to provide additional documentation or clarify certain aspects of your analysis. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop downtown, away from the Meridian Financial Building. Agent Reynolds warned me to be discreet and not to discuss our investigation with anyone at the company. The next morning, I sat across from Agent Reynolds and her partner, Agent Michael Chen, in a corner booth at a busy Starbucks. They were both younger than I had expected, probably in their 30s, but they had a professional competence that was reassuring. Agent Reynolds opened a laptop and pulled out a legal pad. Let's start from the beginning. Walk us through exactly how you discovered these discrepancies. For the next 2 hours, I explained every detail of my investigation. I showed them the original financial reports, my calculations, and my analysis of how the fraud was being executed. They asked detailed questions about the company's accounting practices, the individuals involved, and the timeline of events. Agent Chen took extensive notes while Agent Reynolds asked follow-up questions that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of corporate finance. Based on what you've shown us, it appears that someone at Meridian Financial is using a technique called earnings management to artificially inflate the company's reported profits. Agent Reynolds explained, they're moving expenses between quarters, recognizing revenue prematurely. and using off-balance sheet entities to hide losses. The $15 million discrepancy you identified is just the tip of the iceberg, Agent Chen added. If our preliminary analysis is correct, this fraud may go back several years and involve significantly more money. I felt a mixture of vindication and alarm. I had been right about the fraud, but it was apparently much worse than I had realized. What happens now? I asked. Agent Reynolds exchanged a look with her partner. We're going to need to conduct a full forensic audit of Meridian Financial's books. That means we'll be requesting documents, interviewing employees, and potentially executing search warrants. Wenzi, we'll also need you to continue working at the company as if nothing has happened. Can you do that? The thought of going back to my basement office and pretending to be defeated was not appealing, but I understood the importance of not alerting the company to the investigation. How long will this take? It depends on what we find and how cooperative the company is. It could be weeks, or it could be months. I left the coffee shop feeling like I was living in a spy movie. I had become a federal informant, and I was about to help bring down a multi-million-dollar corporate fraud scheme. The next few weeks were surreal. I continued my mundane work in the basement, scanning old documents and organizing files, while knowing that federal agents were quietly building a case against my employer. I watched my colleagues go about their daily routines, unaware that their company was under investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission. I also noticed that the tension in the executive offices was increasing. There were more closed-door meetings, more hushed conversations, and a general sense of anxiety that seemed to be spreading throughout the building. Agent Reynolds contacted me periodically to ask follow-up questions or request additional documentation. She told me that their investigation was progressing well and that they had uncovered evidence supporting my initial findings. We've identified several other instances of fraudulent reporting going back 3 years, she explained during one of our phone calls. The total amount of fraud appears to be significantly higher than your initial estimate. How much higher? We're still calculating, but it could be as much as $50 million. I felt sick. I had worked for this company for 3 years, believing that we were providing legitimate financial services to our clients. Instead, I had been unknowingly complicit in a massive fraud scheme. Is there any chance that the executives involved will face criminal charges? Agent Reynolds paused. I can't discuss the details of our investigation, but I can tell you that cases of this magnitude often result in both civil and criminal penalties. As the weeks passed, I began to notice changes in the behavior of key executives. Margaret Stevenson looked increasingly haggard, and I heard rumors that she was working late into the night, often on weekends. The CEO, Richard Hawthorne, who had always been a visible presence in the office, seemed to be traveling more frequently and was rarely seen in the building. I also noticed that some of the senior finance staff had become more secretive about their work. Documents that had previously been readily available on shared drives were now password-protected or missing entirely. Email communications that had once been routine were now being conducted through private channels. It was clear that someone suspected they were under investigation, even if they didn't know the full extent of the SEC's involvement. One morning in early May, about 6 weeks after my first meeting with Agent Reynolds, I received an urgent call from her while I was on my way to work. Jessica, I need you to stay away from the office today. Don't go to Meridian Financial under any circumstances. My heart started racing. What's happening? I can't give you details over the phone, but there's going to be significant law enforcement activity at your workplace today. We'll need to meet with you later to discuss what happens next. I spent the day at home, pacing around my apartment and obsessively checking news websites for any mention of Meridian Financial. By afternoon, I couldn't take the suspense anymore. So I drove to within a few blocks of the office building and parked where I could see the entrance. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. The building was surrounded by federal agents. There were unmarked cars with government license plates, agents in FBI windbreakers carrying boxes of documents, and a crowd of confused-looking employees standing on the sidewalk, apparently having been evacuated from the building. I watched as Agent Reynolds emerged from the building, followed by several other agents carrying computer equipment and file boxes. Behind them, I could see Margaret Stevenson being led out in handcuffs. her face pale and her professional composure completely shattered. A few minutes later, Richard Hawthorne was also led out in handcuffs, along with two other executives I recognized from the finance department. I sat in my car, watching the scene unfold, and felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction in seeing the people who had tried to silence me facing the consequences of their actions. There was also sadness for the innocent employees who would now have to deal with the fallout of their employer's crimes. But mostly, there was relief. I had done the right thing, and justice was being served. My phone rang. It was Agent Reynolds. "Jessica, I'm sure you've heard about what happened today. Can you meet us at the Federal Building in 2 hours? We need to debrief you on the investigation and discuss what happens next." "Of course. But can you tell me anything about what you found?" "Let's just say that your initial report was very accurate and very timely. If you hadn't come forward when you did, this fraud could have continued for years and caused much more damage." I met with Agent Reynolds and Agent Chen at the Federal Building that afternoon. They explained that the raid had been the culmination of a 2-month investigation that had uncovered a massive, systematic fraud scheme involving multiple executives and spanning several years. Based on our forensic audit, we estimate that Meridian Financial defrauded shareholders of approximately $75 million over a 4-year period. Agent Reynolds explained, $75 million. The number was staggering. The scheme involved manipulating earnings reports, hiding losses in off-balance sheet entities, and providing false information to auditors and regulators. Agent Chen added, "It was sophisticated, well-coordinated, and would have been very difficult to detect without someone on the inside raising red flags." They told me that 5 executives had been arrested, including Margaret Stevenson and Richard Hawthorne. All were facing federal charges for securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. "What about the employees who weren't involved in the fraud?" I asked. "The company will likely face significant fines and may be forced to restructure or declare bankruptcy," Agent Reynolds said. "Unfortunately, innocent employees often suffer when their employers engage in criminal behavior." I felt a pang of guilt for the colleagues who would lose their jobs through no fault of their own. But I also knew that if the fraud had continued, the eventual collapse would have been even more devastating. "There's something else we need to discuss," Agent Chen said. "As the whistleblower who reported this fraud, you're entitled to a percentage of any civil penalties recovered by the SEC. I had read about whistleblower rewards during my research, but I hadn't really considered the financial implications. The exact amount will depend on the final settlement, but based on the scope of the fraud we've uncovered, your reward could be substantial, potentially several $million. I sat back in my chair, trying to process everything that had happened. 3 months ago, I had been a mid-level accountant who discovered some irregularities in financial reports. Now I was a federal whistleblower who had helped expose a $75 million fraud scheme. And I was potentially about to receive a multi-million-dollar reward. "What happens now?" I asked. "The criminal cases will move forward through the courts. The executives who were arrested will likely face trial. And if convicted, they could face significant prison sentences," Agent Reynolds explained. "The SEC will also pursue civil penalties against the company and the individuals involved. That process could take several years to complete. And I may need to testify in court." "Probably. Your testimony will be crucial in establishing how the fraud was discovered and how the company responded to your internal report." I left the Federal Building feeling like I was in a dream. The events of the past few months had been surreal, but the consequences were very real. I had helped expose a major corporate fraud and potentially prevented even more investors from losing their money. But I had also lost my job, my sense of security, and my faith in the corporate world. Over the next several weeks, the Meridian financial scandal made national news. The story of how a mid-level accountant had uncovered a massive fraud scheme and been demoted for her efforts captured the public's attention. I was contacted by numerous reporters who wanted to interview me about my experience, but I declined most of them on the advice of my newly hired attorney. The legal proceedings were still ongoing, and I needed to be careful about what I said publicly. The one interview I did agree to was with a journalist from the Wall Street Journal who was writing a comprehensive article about corporate whistleblowing. I felt that it was important to encourage other employees to come forward when they discovered wrongdoing, even if it meant risking their careers. The hardest part wasn't discovering the fraud, I told the reporter. It was deciding what to do about it. I knew that reporting it would probably end my career at Meridian Financial, but I also knew that staying silent would make me complicit in stealing from shareholders. The article was published a few weeks later, and I received dozens of emails from other employees who had faced similar situations. Some had come forward and faced retaliation, while others had stayed silent and regretted it. One email, from a woman named Patricia, who worked at a tech company in California, particularly struck me. I discovered that my company was inflating user numbers to attract investors, but I was too scared to report it. I kept telling myself that it wasn't my responsibility, that someone else would figure it out. 2 years later, the company went public based on fraudulent data, and thousands of investors lost money when the truth came out. I should have been as brave as you were. I realized that my story had become bigger than just my own experience. It had become a symbol of the importance of speaking up when you witness wrongdoing, regardless of the personal cost. The criminal trials began 8 months after the arrests. Margaret Stevenson, Richard Hawthorne, and the other executives had all pleaded not guilty, and their lawyers were arguing that they had acted in good faith and that any irregularities were the result of honest mistakes or misunderstandings. I testified in both Margaret's and Richard's trials, describing how I had discovered the fraud and how the company had responded to my report. It was intimidating to be cross-examined by defense attorneys who tried to portray me as a disgruntled employee who had misunderstood complex financial transactions. But the evidence was overwhelming. The forensic audit had uncovered clear evidence of intentional fraud, including email communications between executives discussing how to hide losses and manipulate earnings reports. Margaret Stevenson was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Richard Hawthorne received 15 years. The other executives received sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years. The civil case took even longer to resolve. The SEC pursued penalties against both the company and the individual executives, while shareholders filed a class action lawsuit seeking damages for their losses. 2 years after I first discovered the fraud, the cases were finally settled. Meridian Financial agreed to pay over $100 million in fines and restitution, though the company had already declared bankruptcy by that point. As the whistleblower who had initiated the investigation, I received a reward of $12 million from the SEC. It was more money than I had ever imagined having, but it came with a complex set of emotions. I was grateful for the financial security, but I was also acutely aware that the money represented the losses of thousands of investors who had trusted Meridian Financial with their savings. I used part of the reward to establish a foundation that provides support and legal assistance to corporate whistleblowers. Too many employees who witness wrongdoing stay silent because they can't afford to lose their jobs or fight legal battles against their employers. I also went back to school to get a law degree, focusing on securities law and corporate compliance. I wanted to use my experience to help other companies avoid the kind of fraud that had destroyed Meridian Financial. Looking back on the experience now, 5 years later, I'm proud of the decision I made to report the fraud. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't popular with my former colleagues, but it was the right thing to do. I learned that corporate fraud is often an open secret, known to multiple employees but unreported because of fear, apathy, or misplaced loyalty. I also learned that the vast majority of fraud is discovered by employees, not by auditors or regulators. Most importantly, I learned that one person really can make a difference. When I first found those discrepancies in the financial reports, I was just a mid-level accountant with a mortgage and student loans. I had no special training in fraud detection, no connections to law enforcement, and no reason to believe that anyone would take my concerns seriously. But I had something more important than any of those things. I had the courage to speak up when I saw something wrong. The executives who orchestrated the fraud at Meridian Financial thought they were untouchable. They believed that their positions of authority, their expensive lawyers, and their ability to silence dissent would protect them from consequences. They were wrong. Sometimes justice comes slowly, and sometimes it comes at great personal cost. But it does come, especially when ordinary people are willing to do extraordinary things to make it happen. I may have been demoted to a basement office for finding a $15 million fraud, but 72 hours later, I watched those same executives get led away in handcuffs by federal agents. And that, I can honestly say, was the sweetest revenge of all.